Interpreters and admin don't sit at the operational table. That was what Lieutenant Colonel Vance said at 0220 hours in the planning tent at FOBR deck, and he didn't raise his voice to say it. He reached across and picked up her access badge. She had set it on the table near her notepad, the way everyone did, and placed it face down in front of her. Then he looked back at the map without further comment, as if he'd moved a coffee cup. I was at the comms table 8 feet away. I heard every word. I said nothing. Her name was not on the brief roster. The duty officer had added her that afternoon at the request of the J2 section chief, some notation about language assets and route familiarity in the Mosrev corridor. The lieutenant colonel hadn't seen the paperwork, or hadn't read past the first line. Either way, he looked at her, compact, in plain tan blouse and unmarked plate carrier, no unit patch, no rank tab, and made his assessment in about 2 seconds. She had no markings he recognized, no posture he associated with operators, no credential he could read from where he stood. She looked, in that tent, like someone who had wandered into the wrong room. She picked up the badge without looking at it and walked out. 19 operators stayed at the table. The brief continued. I went back to my console and ran my pre-mission checks, and if I thought anything about what I had just watched, it was the kind of thought you file away and don't examine. Some murmur about the colonel being thorough, about protocol, about the J2 section probably not having coordinated properly. The planning tent had a certain gravity to it at 0220. Everything moved forward. I moved forward with it. I told myself those things and believed them for about 3 hours. The mission went in at 0340. Alpha Element, 7 operators, Mosrev Sector 4. The objective was a 3-story trade warehouse on grid 219-088 with an intelligence cache and 2 source personnel who needed to come out before first light. Clean plan. 2 exfil routes pre-cleared, vehicle at the southern staging point, QRF on standby at FOBR deck. I had run comms on 12 briefs that quarter, and this one had the kind of tightness that made you settle into the work. By 0412, the plan had come apart at every seam. The first IED went at 0403, on the vehicle at the southern staging point. Nobody killed, but the primary exfil was gone and 3 of the 7 operators were cut off on the north side of the objective block, Dunford, Tice, and a staff sergeant I knew from a rotation 2 years back named Caro. The other 4 made it back across the main road in the confusion, along with 1 source contact. The second source contact did not make it. I had Dunford's radio briefly at 0408. His position was bad. They had pushed north into the building row along Sector 4 Bravo, trying to get angle on the IED site, and now they were in a 4-building block with 2 armed groups working the street below them and no clear path south. The QRF was 12 minutes out and the window for a safe exfil was closing. Dunford gave me the grid and then his radio went out, battery or damage, I never learned which, and I was working from the last known position and whatever the overhead assets could give me, which at that altitude and in that light was not much. I called the QRF commander and gave him the grid. I called the battalion S3 and gave him the situation. I ran through every contingency on my board and none of them resolved cleanly. The secondary exfil route ran through the same street corridor as the southern staging point. The northern approach was a dead end in the mapping. I had been staring at the Mosrev Sector 4 map for 4 hours and I knew every route on it, and every route I knew was either compromised or blocked or took the QRF through the armed element working the south side of the block. 12 minutes felt like it was shrinking. The overhead feed showed 2 heat signatures moving north on the western approach, which meant the south group was repositioning. The eastern edge of the block was dark. Dunford's radio stayed silent. I tried the alternate frequency twice and got static both times, and I sat there with my hands on the console and my eyes on a map that had no good answers on it, and I did not think about the woman who had walked out of the planning tent 4 hours earlier because that was not a thought that seemed relevant at 0409 hours with 3 operators pinned and the QRF still 8 minutes out. I was still working the problem when the reserve channel keyed. I almost missed it. Reserve channel ran through a secondary board on my left, low volume, and I had both hands on the primary console. But the key was held long enough that I caught it and turned. No voice. Just the channel key and a pause, and then 3 clicks in the pattern we used for position confirmation. I looked at the board and looked at the grid reference that came through 30 seconds later, written in a channel notation I had never seen before, a format from a J2 classification code I did not have clearance for. The grid was 200 meters north of Dunford's last known. It was the blind alley between buildings 3 and 4 on the north side of the block, the slot that didn't appear on our planning maps because the satellite pass that imaged it had been overwritten by a newer pass at a different angle. It appeared on exactly one document in our system, and that document was in the J2 annex behind a classification tier I couldn't open. She was already in the block. I don't know how she went in. The QRF commander told me later that his lead vehicle, coming in from the east approach at 0411, had passed a figure moving fast along the drainage ditch that ran parallel to Sector 4 Bravo, low, in kit, no visible unit markings. He'd called it in as unknown and been told to continue. She had 2 minutes on the QRF and she used them to put herself inside the problem while the rest of us were still diagramming it from outside. What I know from the radio logs and from Dunford's debrief is this: at 0414 she reached their position in the blind alley between buildings 3 and 4. Caro had a fragment wound in his left leg, mobile but slow. Dunford and Tice were unhurt. The armed element working the south side of the block was 12 to 15 personnel moving in 2 groups. The north approach had a 3-man position on the roof of building 2 covering the only road out. The QRF, even at speed, would take another 8 minutes to reach them and would arrive loud, vehicles, radio traffic, the full signature. The 3-man roof position would hear them first and the pincer below would hear them second. She didn't wait for the QRF. What she did in the next hour and 40 minutes I have assembled from 3 sources: Dunford's debrief, Tice's after-action statement, and a single paragraph in the classified annex that the J2 section chief read aloud at the AAR 2 days later. I was not there when she did it. I was at my console at FOB RDEC watching grid coordinates move across a board I barely had clearance to read, reconstructing each step from transmissions that came in fragments, in code blocks I had to look up one at a time, in a channel format I had never been trained on. Every time a new grid came through I updated my plot and checked it against the sector map and found another line she was using that I didn't have in my files. She moved them building by building. Not south, which was the obvious route and the compromised one, but east along the blind alley and then through a passage between buildings 1 and 2 that the planning maps showed as a solid wall. It was not a solid wall. It was a double-thickness partition with a loading slot at ground level, wide enough for a person moving flat. She knew this because she had written the route document that described it, the same document that lived in the J2 annex behind the classification tier I couldn't open, the one the duty officer hadn't known to check. Caro she moved first, Tice supporting his weight while she went ahead and cleared each transition point. The 3-man roof position never came into play because she took the route that put 2 buildings between them and that position at every moment of movement. The south group's 2 elements were working toward each other in a pincer, but the timing on that pincer assumed the operators were still in the northern part of the block. She had them east of the pincer before it closed, moving low through the loading passage while the 2 armed groups met on the street above and north of them and found nothing. I watched the grid coordinates and I ran the numbers and I still could not fully reconstruct what she was doing until the J2 section chief explained it 2 days later. She was running a close protection exfil protocol developed for exactly this terrain type: 4-building urban block, multiple contact groups, single friendly element with a casualty, a protocol that had been written, the J2 section chief said quietly, by the woman who used it. At 0517 she keyed the reserve channel again. 3 clicks and a grid. The grid was the eastern drainage mouth at the edge of Sector 4 Bravo, 200 meters from the QRF's secondary staging position. The QRF reached them at 0523. Dunford on his own feet, Tice on his own feet, Caro moving with assistance, the fragment wound already dressed and field stabilized. All 3 home. I didn't know her name yet. I knew the call sign, 2 words in a J2 format that came across the reserve channel at 0519 when I was copying the final grid, but I didn't place it until 2 days later at the AAR when the J2 section chief opened a file on the briefing screen and read from it without preamble. 19 confirmed solo asset extractions. 4 theaters. Close protection and intelligence extraction specialist, attached undercover designation to the J2 section as a language and route consultant. The cover designation was a standard administrative notation that, read quickly, looked like interpreter support staff. The classification tier on her actual file required a separate access code that the planning roster at FOB RDEC had not included because the duty officer who assembled it had not known there was a second tier to check. Call sign, Iron Shelf. The J2 section chief read the paragraph about Caro fragment wound and the route through the partition between buildings 1 and 2. He read the paragraph about the eastern drainage mouth and the close protection protocol. He closed the folder and looked at the room without saying anything further. Lieutenant Colonel Vance was at the head of the table. He had not moved during the reading. When the J2 section chief closed the folder, the lieutenant colonel pushed his chair back, stood, and walked the length of the table. 15 feet, maybe 18. He stopped in front of her and picked up her access badge from the tabletop. She had set it near her notepad again, the same place, the same habit, and placed it face up in front of her. He came to attention. She looked at the badge. She did not look at him. She made a small note in the margin of her route document and went back to reading. I think about that badge. The way it was placed down the first time and the way it was placed down the second time, and how those two moments weighed differently in the same pair of hands. I have run a lot of pre-mission checks since FOB RDEC. I have said nothing when I should have said something, and I have told myself afterward that protocol was the reason, and then I have thought about a reserve channel I almost missed and an alley that wasn't on my maps and 3 operators who came home because someone went back in while I was still diagramming the problem from outside. The badge is the thing I come back to. Face down is a 2-second decision. Face up cost him 18 feet across a room in front of everyone who had watched the first time, and he walked every inch of it without being told to. That is not a small thing to do. It does not settle what the first 2 seconds cost: Dunford's dead radio, Caro leg, a loading slot in a wall that I didn't have in my files because I hadn't checked the second tier, but it is the only honest response to it, and it is more than I managed. I read every roster attachment now before I sign. When I find a notation I don't recognize, I look up the tier. It takes longer. Some nights I am still at the console after everyone else has cleared out, reading through to the bottom of the annex, making sure I know what is in the room. It takes about as long as it took her to bring them home.